Hi everybody, welcome to my channel, Life, Law, Bin. Stage. And now that I'm saying advance to the interview stage, how did you prepare for interviews, both first and second round?
Sure. So I'm going to get to my other notes now, which are for interview.
Yes,
So again,
you can provide
I've
your
come
top tips
prepared.
one time. You can provide your top tips.
Great. So I think perhaps it's helpful before sort of talking about my top tips on interview, talking a little bit about the type of interviews that I did.
Yeah.
So for first rounds, I had a mixture of interviews. Some I was sent a case in advance to read and consider. If you're in that position, you want to be thinking whether you agree with the judgment. Even if you don't agree with the judgment, how would you argue for the other side? Is there a dissenting judgment? If there is, what is the person saying? And what are the judicial opinions? And any academic commentary that's sort of come from it since. The others are, I had a couple of first rounds with debating topics that I didn't know until I went into the interview. So practice in current affairs, sort of points for topics, points against, so that you can quickly pick a side and argue it convincingly. And others I had were reading law reform proposals and applying a set of facts and a statute to them. And then sort of some second round example interviews I had where one, I had to produce a skeleton argument and do a relief from sanction application. So if you are applying for a PI and ClinNeg pupillage and you are thinking about advocacy applications that may come up, relief from sanctions, definitely one of them. Another one, which I know some people who applied for this specialism also had, were applications for interim injunctions. So think about those kind of applications too. And ethical scenarios. I hadn't actually studied ethics yet on my bar course at the time of application season. So sort of familiarizing yourself with the core duties for those. So that's sort of the context of the styles of interviews and the kind of exercises that I was being asked to do. In terms of advice, I remember when I got my first interview invite and I was speaking to someone and saying how I wanted to make sure that I did it, to the best of my abilities. And they were like, oh, don't worry, everyone, it's a first interview, everyone sort of gets their way through them and you'll be so much better by the time it comes to your second interview. And I remember reflecting on that and thinking, well, I don't want that to happen. I want my first interview to go well because I don't even know if I'm going to get any more. So it's sort of the same with the written side of it, but utilizing all of the resources that I mentioned to now try and do a mock interview with and make sure that by the time you do your first pupillage interview, it's not the first interview you've ever done. So I sort of did 2 or 3 using exactly the same resources that I mentioned, interviews, so that by the time I did my first one, I kind of already felt like I was into the swing of it. And I think that's really important in ensuring that as that person said to me, that first interview isn't sort of a practice one for then the rest of them. I also made myself an answer booklet. So I wrote down in a brainstorm all the competencies that I thought a good barrister had. So that could be things like resilience, communication skills, motivation, problem solving. And I then thought, what do I have in my experience that demonstrates these competencies? And I had a bit of a brainstorm so that I knew if I went into an interview and they said to me, give me an example of a time you were resilient, I'd already thought about it and I had all these experiences and examples up my sleeve that I could then use. And you don't want to rehearse them. You want to make sure that your answers don't sound rehearsed, but you also want to have thought about it before. So that was quite a helpful way for me in making sure that I had those examples. I'd say now that you've thought of those examples, you want to make sure that you're saying them in a structured way. The classic example is I have 3 reasons, 1, 2, and 3. That is a great way to do it. You don't want to do it for every answer, but you want to be signposting the people listening to you to where you're at in the answer and relating it back to the question. So just have a think about the kinds of structures that you might use to talk about the examples that you've thought about. Knowing when to stop is probably another one. I think it can be quite easy to keep talking until the interviewer interrupts you or asks you another question. But even when you're not doing an advocacy exercise, these answers that you're giving to the interview panel are demonstrating your advocacy skills. And one of the key things about being a good advocate, I think, is knowing when to stop, knowing when you've answered your question, and where necessary, being brief. So bear that in mind and don't feel like you just have to keep talking and coming up with new examples. If you've made your point, great, just stop and leave it there. The other thing I'd say is something that I use as a personal tip in interviews, which is that I approach every interview as if it's a two-way interview. And that's a really great way for me in just settling my nerves, in the sense that I think, well, I need to make sure you're a good fit for me as well. But, it's something that isn't spoken about enough in the pupillage cycle, and that is ending up in the really fortunate position of having multiple offers. It's easy to think, well, I just want pupillage, let's just get through it. But I was fortunate to end up with multiple offers, and I have other friends who were. And it's something that I wish was spoken about more, because it's then a really difficult decision to make that you have a time deadline for. And having approached my interviews as sort of that two-way interview really helped me in deciding where I wanted to do my pupillage, because you were thinking about the panel and the way in which they asked their questions, the environment in which you were in, and ultimately how you felt the interview went, to know whether chambers would be a good fit for you. So I'd say don't lose sight of that side of it as well, in that you want to make sure that they're a good fit for where you want to undertake your pupillage. And when I came out of my interviews, then I would write down all the questions that I was asked and all of the answers that I could remember that I'd given. And I thought that would help me in 2 ways. Firstly, I thought if I don't get pupillage this year and I end up wanting to reapply to this chambers, I'm going to want to remember what happened at the interview and why I think, it perhaps didn't go as well as it did. But also it helps you reflect on the answers you've given for any more interviews you get in this cycle. You don't want to be making the same mistakes in every interview if you come out and think, actually, that was a pretty rubbish answer to that, and I probably could have said something much better. Think about it, reflect on it, and if you get asked it again, brilliant. You now know exactly what it is that you want to say. And finally, I'd say, in terms of interviews, make sure in that sort of reflective process, you also have some support. It can be a really difficult time going through interviews, getting rejections for some, having to then, learn you've been rejected from one chambers and walk into the interview for another and not lose sight of that. So, I had some friends who were going through the pupillage process for completely different pupillages. And we would talk after interviews about what happened, how we were feeling. And it was great to speak to someone who understood what you were going through. But it doesn't have to be someone who's going through it if you don't have someone to speak to. But I think making sure that the interview stage isn't a really lonely process is really important, in making sure that in each interview you're showing yourself to your best abilities and you're really reflecting on each interview in a positive way going forward. There's another overview.
No. I want to ask you something that I don't think people speak about enough. And that's
Mhm.
approaching it in a way that it's a two-way interview.
Mhm.
I always hear mixed responses about this, but I really like the way that you approached it, and it got me to thinking. So some people advise that you need to be really careful when you're asking chambers questions, because you don't want to ask them questions that if you had researched thoroughly you would have seen it. But
Sure.
at the same time, I really think that it's key that we as applicants make sure that Chambers is the right fit for us. So I am just wondering to myself, and I wanted to ask you this: were there any questions that you posed the members of the panel after, well, after they completed their kind of interrogation of yourself? So how did you really tailor it to make yourself feel at ease that it is a two-way process?
Yeah, I mean, I totally get what you're saying. It's a bit of a cliche line that some people use, and ultimately, when it comes to pupillage, there aren't many pupillage spaces. You'd be happy probably with pupillage anywhere you've applied to, because that's the reason you've sent an application off to them. So, you know, I get that it is sort of a phrase that you sort of deplore, yet at the same time, you want pupillage from them, and they have hundreds of applicants to sort through. So specifically for me, the way in which I sort of approached the two-way interview and the questions that I was asking were, sure, yeah, do your research. Make sure if you have a question and they have the answer to it online, that you don't ask it again in an interview. Some places that I applied for didn't publish their statistics on how many pupils gained tenancy. And that was something that I thought was really important if I ended up in a situation with more than one offer, which was, well, if I go to this Chambers, do they recruit me with an aim for tenancy, or do they recruit 5 pupils for 3 spots as a tenant? So if Chambers hadn't been transparent with that statistic, that was often something that I asked at the end of the interview, and I think it's something that's important to know. Other questions that I asked would be if there was a panel member. This is mainly more for second round interviews. First round interviews are a bit more fast paced and less sort of chatty, I found. But sometimes if I knew in advance the panelists, I would consider what specialism within PI and Clin-Neg, let's say, they did, and if there was anything interesting that they'd done that I wanted to know more about, and there was time at the end of the interview, that would sort of be when I would talk about those things. And I think that can be a great way to show that you are genuinely interested in Chambers' work, you're generally interested in the work of that panelist, and you've done your research enough to know what it is that they're doing to ask a question that you couldn't just find out on the internet. So it's something that I thought about before an interview. It was never something I sort of came up with on the spot. But certainly, you know, and read the room. You know, if the panel are rushed and they don't really have time to talk, they're not going to want to get into a discussion about it, anything really. But some interviews that I had, they were really receptive to that, and they'd sort of had 10 minutes at the end of the interview to say, have you got any questions? Well, that's 10 minutes that you can then utilize to learn more about Chambers and show that you are genuinely interested. So in those circumstances, they were the kind of questions that I was asking. But I didn't ask questions in every interview. If I actually genuinely didn't have a question, I didn't come up with one just for the sake of it.
I think that's a good point, because I know for a fact that some first rounds, as you said, are fast paced,
Yeah.
especially if they're on Zoom as well. They have a limited time period, and they have people probably coming in every, like, what, 20 minutes.
Yeah.
So so when they tell you it ends here, they mean it ends here. And I think the last thing you want to do is kind of annoy the panel by saying, "But wait, I have a question. Wait."
Yeah, sometimes they don't invite questions. That's not then the time to come out with some, you know, legal question that you've thought of. I think my shortest interview was about 7 minutes long, and I think my longest was nearly about 2 hours. So yeah, read the room, read the interview, read the panelists, and make sure that you genuinely want to know the answer to this question, and it's not just sort of a tactic you're deploying to come off as a better candidate.
Yeah, and I think reading people's expression and reading the room is also a skill that you must have going to the bar, because most of the time, especially in civil, you're trying to persuade the judge. And sometimes you have to recognize from the judge's expression and body language that they're not with you. They're really not with you,
Yeah.
and they want to find against your client. So I
Yeah.
think you Sometimes you really have to read the room because some people just no, don't know. The last question, B, before I let you go, do you think there is a specific way that applicants can keep up to date with current affairs and cases in their chosen area of practice? Because everything that seems to be coming through with all kinds of pupillage webinars and advice sessions is that people need to be up to date with the law, current affairs, and basically topical issues. So, where can people go to keep up to date while leading their busy lives?
Yeah, great question. So the morning of an interview, if I had time, I would try my best to read that morning's paper electronically. That's because I found that with current affairs, people were often interested in the news of that day. You know, whilst they are current, generally they were current in that moment rather than sort of the last week's worth of news. So I would do that. I would also use some resources. For example, there's an Inner Temple sort of resources newsletter that they use. That's great at signposting you to different places and different current affairs that are going on. Another thing is the Supreme Court website. They post recent judgments. Keep an eye on that. If you get a sort of groundbreaking judgment on one of your days, then you want to make sure that you're checking that website. I think in one of my interviews, the Uber judgment came out. And actually in the interview, I wasn't expected to know about it because it was, as I say, as the interview was going on. But the panelist stopped and said the Uber judgment's just been delivered. If I had been in an interview the next day, I would want to make sure that I knew it had just been delivered and I knew what the outcome was. So yeah, keep an eye on the Supreme Court website as well. And also legal Twitter. Legal Twitter is a great place to stay up to date. Follow people who are interested in your areas or practice in your areas. Because during the application cycle, it's hard to, prepare for all of these interviews and keep up to date in everything that's going on in the news. But if you're following really prominent members of the profession in your area and something happens that's current affairs and topical, the likelihood is someone will tweet about it. And I found that a really great way to flag to me whether something had just happened that was of interest to the people who are then going to be people who are interviewing me. So yeah, whilst they're not going to discuss it in the depth that you need to know it, it's a great starting place to then know what it is that you need to go away and research.
Well, B, that's a wrap. Thank you so much for being helpful, very, very helpful. So far, I think our workshop series is going really well because we've had fantastic guests. So thank you for your information and for sharing your knowledge.
Thank you very much for having me.
Not a problem at all, and hopefully we'll have you again sometime in the future. Thanks, everybody. We'll see you both. We'll see you again on the next episode. Have a good one, guys. Bye.